Hi there, and welcome to Heritage at Home, where we're going to demonstrate some popular heritage skills and techniques for you to watch and maybe even try in the comfort of your home. These are things you would typically see at the Union County Heritage Festival. This is brought to you in partnership by the Union County Heritage Festival Board of Directors, the Union County Museum, and the University of Tennessee Extension Service in Union County. Today I'll be demonstrating how to properly preserve pickles in a water bath canner. For canning success, one of the most important things you need is a good tested recipe. When we're referring to a tested recipe in regard to canning and food preservation, what we mean is a recipe that has been tested in a laboratory to be sure that the contents of the jars gets to the proper temperature to kill any bacteria while processing in your canner. Excellent resources to use for tested recipes are the So Easy to Preserve cookbook, as well as the Canning Foods Guide put together by the University of Tennessee. These are available in your local extension office. The recipe we're using today is for dill pickles. Your recipe may be different, and depending on your preferences, there are a variety of pickle recipes. Part of the services offered to you by your local extension office are offering recipes. So if you have questions or you're looking for a particular recipe, give your local extension office a call. For our dill pickles today, we're going to combine 6 cups of vinegar. With that, we will be adding 3 cups of sugar, 2 tablespoons of salt, and 2 tablespoons of pickling spices. After combining these ingredients, we're going to heat on low heat to medium heat until the mixture begins to boil, and you want to keep it at a simmer for at least 15 minutes. What this does is it heats the pickling liquid so that any bacteria that may be present is cooked, and then it prepares the cooking liquid to the proper consistency to be ready to can your pickles. Now, when we're preparing cucumbers for this recipe, there's a couple things you want to look for. You're looking primarily for the freshest cucumbers possible. These may be from your backyard or they may be from a local farmer's market, but what you're really looking for is a pickling cucumber variety. Pickling cucumber varieties are a little different than slicing cucumbers you would see on a salad because they're shorter and they're more plump, which makes them perfect for pickles. The seeds are smaller and there's not as much of a seed cavity on the inside, so they really do well with canning and are recommended if you're pickling pickles for a recipe. What you want to do is you want to cut off at least a 1/16 of an inch from each side. You want to be sure that your cucumbers are washed to remove any dirt or debris. The most common cause of bacteria, yeast, or mold in preserved foods is actually dirt and water. And we can do a lot to remove that by having a clean workspace and washing our produce ahead of time. After you have washed all of your produce, you want to inspect the cucumbers to be sure that there's no punctures. If there are any punctures or cuts, that creates the opportunity for bacteria to have entered the product. So those are still great to eat and to cook with, but we want to be a little picky when we're choosing our produce for food preservation because this is going to be sitting on a shelf and we want to decrease the bacteria as much as possible. After you've chosen and washed your cucumbers, you can cut them into slices that are about 1/4 of an inch thick. This really is determined by preference and your recipe. It's important to note that the recipe that you use may tell you to cut your pickles differently, and that may not seem very important, but it is, because the amount or thickness that the pickle is cut to, that the cucumber is cut to, as well as the shape, are very important in determining how much canning liquid is able to get in the jar around that product. So we want to be sure that we follow the recipe because we know that that's been tested. After you've prepared your canning liquid and you've prepared your cucumbers, you're ready to get started in the next process of canning. While your pickling liquid is simmering, it's a great opportunity for you to prepare the rest of your equipment and materials. After you've cut and washed your cucumbers, it's a good idea to go ahead and prepare your canning jars. There's several things you want to consider when gathering equipment for canning. Canning jars come with a two-piece lid. You have a ring and you have a lid with a seal. You want to inspect the seal around the canning lid to be sure there's no cracks or debris, because this seal around the outside is what actually seals the jar and creates a barrier so that no bacteria can enter. In order to prepare your rings and lids, you can wash them in warm soapy water, set the rings aside, and for the lids, go ahead and put them in a saucepan on the stove with warm water and bring just to a boil in order to begin melting the seal around the outside. To prepare your jars, you always want to double check the recipe and be sure you have the right size jar. Remember that your recipe has been tested for a specific jar size, and there may be different processing times to process in your canner depending on the size of the jar. That's because a bigger jar is going to have more contents. There's going to be more pickles inside, and it's going to take longer to heat the internal temperature of that jar to a safe temperature to kill any bacteria. In order to preserve food safely, we're really trying to control bacteria in three main ways. We're removing as much dirt and debris from the product as possible. We're heating the food through boiling our canning liquid. We're cleaning our jars. And then we're actually processing these jars in a water bath canner to bring the internal temperature hot enough to kill any bacteria. It also, processing in the canner, forces oxygen out of the product so that we create a low oxygen environment. This is important. However, a low oxygen environment is exactly what botulism enjoys. So sometimes with canning, the biggest concern is botulism growth. Botulism can grow in low oxygen, low acid environments. So in order to water bath can pickles, jams, and jellies safely, we need to be sure that the pH of the food is as low as possible, as acidic as possible. We do that by combining the vinegar with salt and sugar. For foods that do not have a low acid content, such as green beans, you're going to want to use a pressure canner for that, not a water bath canner. If you have questions about how to use a pressure canner, contact your local extension office. Tomatoes are one of the most common questions we get. Tomatoes, you would think, are a high acid food, but due to nutritional changes over time, we do recommend that you add additional acid to tomatoes and salsas in the form of vinegar, salts, or sugars. So again, consult your recipe. In order to prepare your pickles, you want to be sure to pack the jar where you're not creating spaces that liquid cannot enter. For example, if we have two cucumbers right next to each other, liquid cannot get in between. Our goal with pickling safe pickles is to pack them in the jar so that we have space in between the product for our canning liquid to enter. You may have heard the term fancy pack, where they're all packed in very tightly, and whereas that sometimes is a very beautiful look, it's not the safest way to pack pickles. My favorite way to pack pickles is to take some of the slices that are bigger, put around the outside, and then take smaller slices to touch the bottom, so that we have sort of a stacking method here where we're staggering them, we're putting them in different directions. It also can be very pretty from the outside. So this is just a demonstration of how you will pack those pickles. When preparing your jars, first you can wash with warm soapy water, and then to prepare the jars to have the product added, you need to do one of two things. If your processing time in your recipe is more than 10 minutes, there's no need to sterilize the jars in boiling water. However, if you're processing in a water bath canner for less than 10 minutes, you need to sterilize your jars in boiling water beforehand. The first step with jars is to clean the jar. You can do that in a dishwasher or with warm soapy water. Next, you need to determine whether or not sterilization is necessary based on the processing time in your recipe. And lastly, if you're packing with anything that has a warm liquid, such as apple butter or pickles, you need to heat your jars so that you're not adding a hot product to a cold jar. If you add a hot product to a cold jar, it can create cracking and even cause your jars to burst. One way to warm your jars is to put them in the oven on 200 degrees to keep them warm, or you can also put them in a large pot or your water bath canner. Begin to warm the water, and when you're ready to pack the jars, you can use a jar lifter to take the jars out of the pot. Carefully remove any water that has entered the jar. And then you've got a warm jar ready to be packed and filled. Once your warm jars are removed from your canner or the oven, you want to be sure to pack all of the jars using the method that we previously described. Want to be sure that there's space between the pickles so that liquid can enter. As you're packing your pickles, it's also important to pay attention to headspace. Your recipe will call for a specific headspace. In the case of pickles, it's most often 1/2 inch, which is the length of the bandwidth here at the top. So you want to be sure that when you're packing the pickles, you're not packing them higher than the bottom of your lip on your jar. Check your recipe to be sure that you have the correct headspace. Once your pickling liquid has simmered for about 15 minutes, or what is referred to in your recipe, and you've packed your jars with a fresh pack, not too tightly, where there's space for the liquid to enter around the pickles, then you're ready to fill your jars. As you're filling your jars, remember to leave appropriate headspace at the top. It's helpful to use a funnel. Some people prefer for dill pickles to add additional herbs and spices into the jar. You can do things like fresh dill, dry dill, or even garlic cloves. If you're going to add additional herbs and spices, it's best to add them directly to the bottom of the jar or to the top right before filling with liquid. You want to slowly fill your jars to avoid any spills. The combination of vinegar, sugar, and salt is what lowers the pH for our pickles. So we want to be sure that it gets all around the pickles. If you prefer, you can put the whole spices, such as the pickling spices that are in the pickling liquid. You can put it into a small bag of cheesecloth so that you can remove it from the pot. The pickling spices will give your pickling liquid a darker color, but if you like the taste of pickling spices, keeping them in the canning jar will develop more flavor over time. There are pickle recipes that use sugar substitutes rather than using sugar, but it's important to check with your local extension office for a tested recipe. Not all sugar substitutes can be exchanged equally in canning recipes. It's important that every jar is filled with canning liquid. If you end up with a jar that's partially full, feel free to add that to the refrigerator. It will stay good for several weeks and can be used just like your canned pickles would. But in order to process the pickles safely, we want to make sure that every jar is filled all the way to the appropriate headspace. If a jar gets too full, I found the best and easiest way to remove liquid is actually to use a small measuring spoon. After filling all of your jars, it's important to wipe down the rims. That's important because the seal that is created between the sealant on your lid and the jar needs to be free of any debris. You can use a clean, damp washcloth . You also want to be sure that any cavity of air has been removed. It's called debubbling. And what you're doing is you're taking a flat object and just agitating the pickles to allow any air to escape. You want to do this with each jar. And if you can't get a flat object into your jar easily, your pickles are probably packed too tight and will not preserve well. After debubbling the jars, go back and check to be sure that you still have the appropriate headspace in every jar. You can measure this easily with a ruler, and some canning kits come with a device that you can use to measure the headspace. If any air bubbles were removed and the level of the liquid has decreased, add more liquid to ensure that there's enough. You can also get down to eye level in order to see the jars more clearly. Once all of the jars have been filled, debubbled, and the rims wiped clean, you're ready to add the sealant lids. The easiest way to do this is to use a magnetic wand. Place the lid on the jar. When you're heating your lids, it's best to put them sealant down. It makes it easier to remove them from the pot and ensure that the sealant is touching the hottest part of the pot. After adding the lids to every jar, you're ready to place your rings. When placing rings on the jars, it's important to tighten completely and then loosen. This is called fingertip tightness. It's important because you want the ring tight enough on the jar to prevent the lid from moving around. The sealant needs to maintain good contact with the jar. However, if it's too tight, the oxygen from the products will not be allowed to escape, and your jars may burst during processing. Once all your jars have been filled, you've placed your lids, and you've put your rings on to fingertip tightness, you're ready to load your jars into your water bath canner. It's very important when you're lifting the lid of your canner that you open it away from you. If you're using the Fresh Tech electric water bath canner, you also want to remove the diffuser ring. When loading your jars, use a jar lifter and place your jars carefully into the bottom of your canner. Remember that when using a water bath canner, you should have a rack on the bottom of your canner so that your jars are not directly touching the bottom of the pot. placing all jars into your canner, you want to be sure that there's at least 1 to 2 inches of water above the lids of the jars. And then you want to add the lid to the canner. The process for water bath canning is to warm the water, add the jars, then wait for a boil. Once the water begins to boil, you can set a timer for the processing time called for in the recipe. In this case, it's 15 minutes. Once the water begins to boil, we can start our timer and we'll process for the full 15 minutes. After that 15-minute period, we'll remove the lid of the canner, turn it off, and wait 5 minutes before removing your jars. If you're using the electric water bath canner from Ball, be sure that your dial is turned to canning setting and process for the full 15 minutes called for in the recipe on the canning setting. You can heat your water up to high, and when you begin canning, turn to the canning setting. After your jars have processed for the full time period indicated in your recipe, you want to immediately turn off the heat or unplug the canner from the wall. Remove the lid with the steam facing away from you. And allow the pot to cool down for 5 minutes without disturbing the jars. After that 5-minute time period, you can begin to remove your jars. If using the electric water bath canner, you want to be sure to carefully remove the diffuser ring. As you're emptying your jars from the canner, it's important to lift them out slowly. You do not want to tip the jar at all, even to remove the water from the top of the lid. You want to take the jar directly to the surface where you'll leave it undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. Any extra water that has pooled on top of the lid should drain down the sides of the jar. You may hear your lids begin to pop. But it's important to note that just because the lid is popping, that does not mean that it has sealed. In order for the sealant on the lids to work, it has to be heated and processed, and then it has to cool completely before the jar is sealed. It's great to hear the pops because you feel like you've done something right and it's been a success. But you still want to wait a full 12 to 24 hours before disturbing the jars. It's important to space the jars at least a couple inches apart so that there's adequate room for air to cool between the jars. If you're using an electric water bath canner like the Fresh Tech electric water bath canner and multi-cooker made from the Ball company, you can use the spigot on the side to empty the water into the sink after it's cooled slightly. If using a water bath canner on your stove, allow the temperature of the water to come down slightly before emptying that water. After allowing these jars to cool and rest for 12 to 24 hours, you can remove the rings and be sure that all the jars have sealed properly. If the jars are sealed properly, the jar will not flex back and forth when you touch the top of it.